Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today as we continue on with our 2021 spring webinar series. My name is Patrick Anderson, and I am an arborologist here with Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements, where I work with our local territory managers and our clients throughout the country to bring protocol training and support. So real quick, some housekeeping before we get into it today. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box in the control panel there. And we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. If you want to put in your ISA certification number, if you did not put in your ISA certification number at the time of registration, please put that also in the Q&A box. It's a lot easier for us to find information in that Q&A box versus in the chat. So if you did not put in your ISA certification when you registered, please do that right now in that Q&A box. And again, don't use the chat for that. Feel free to use the chat to chat amongst yourselves as we go through the conversation today. But again, for questions that you want answered, please put those in the Q&A box. And to get your ISA CU, please put that in the Q&A box. This webinar is going to be recorded and a link will be sent out after the webinar. And then finally, we do have some state pesticide credits for this. So for Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah, you will get a pesticide credit at the conclusion of this webinar, and there will be a link in the chat for that. So look for that, and there'll be more information to come as we get on here. So today, what are we talking about? Tree injection for EAB and other invasive pests. Now, this is a continuation of our spring webinar series, our 2021 spring webinar series. So this is kind of like coming into the story in the middle of the movie, which is fine. But if you want some more background on emerald ash borer and some of these other pests that we're going to touch on, I'd highly encourage you to go to our website or go to our YouTube page and watch some of the previous webinars that are going to go into a lot more detail in these pests here. Today, we're going to really be focusing on tree injection, the best management practices for tree injection, and then how it ties into managing emerald ash borer and some other invasive pests that we've been discussing throughout today. And so our outcomes today, we're going to review the best management practices for tree injection. And really, we're going to kind of relate this management using trunk injection to these BMPs. So we're going to kind of be using the ISA's best management practice for tree injection as a guide through our conversation today and relate that how we would use that in our managing of some of these invasive pests. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So our tree injection BMP. So this came out a few years back and it was requested by members of the industry. Tree injection as a management tool in our toolbox has been around for, decades at this point. But again, there's a lot of, I guess you would say, missing information out there. There is a lot of miscommunication in some of these protocols. So ISA decided that they would put together a best management practice in tree injection. And so the main authors are Dr. Smiley from the Bartlett Tree Research Labs, and then our very own Sean Burdick here at Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements, who's our Chief Science Officer. So those two wrote the content, but then of course it was reviewed by 18 industry experts, including scientists, manufacturers, and commercial tree care professionals. And it took about 3 years to get full alignment in creation here. So there's a lot of brain power that goes into this document. And so that is, of course, why we are going to be using it today as kind of like a guide through our tree injection protocols. And so the BMP, again, it contains an overview of the topic, situations for use, recommended practices, and it provides some neat appendices where we talk about different tree anatomies, and it also provides RFP language specs, which we'll cover briefly today. So let's go through this kind of chapter by chapter, and then we'll relate this to the different management strategies as we go here. So chapter 1 is why use tree injection at all? And so things you want to think about here is, tree injection is a part of our plant healthcare toolbox. And we're going to kind of talk about what the advantage of tree injection is for this conversation, obviously. You want to weigh the pros and cons of tree injection or other management practices. What's best for the tree, the site, and the pest. Those are the things we always want to think about. And then, of course, how that relates to what our clients' expectations are. As part of that too, mentioning that we want to review our other application methods. We can do foliar sprays, we can be doing lower bark spray applications, we could be doing soil applications. And again, just matching the best kind of tool to that tree, site, pest, and then of course, client expectations. And then finally, kind of determining if tree injection is the best course of action. We'll see here for some of these pests, it certainly is the best course of action. So kind of diving into the question of why do tree injection at all? Well, first off, when we do an injection into plant tissue, it protects the chemistry from phytolysis and microbial degradation. So if we are doing some other type of systemic application, that is, if we are applying products into the soil or as a lower bark spray application, that exposes it to sunlight, and certain products are more or less sensitive to sunlight, and that can actually break down the active ingredient, which of course then may reduce our efficacy. The other part of that, of course, is some of these organisms living in the soil around the tree can actually break down and metabolize some of these active ingredients, which of course results in less active ingredient getting into the tree. And then that, of course, results in less activity in the tree, and we might not be getting those results that we're looking for. So that's one of the reasons why using tree injection makes a lot of sense. We're protecting the chemistry. We know exactly where it's going when we're putting it into the tree. Some other interesting things to think about here are the metabolites of some of these chemistries, once broken down by hydrolysis in the plant, have greater insecticidal activities. So something we don't usually think about, and something that we could probably say for some of our other systemic activities as well. But when we directly put these solutions or concentrates into the tree, they're kind of mixing in with that column of water that's in that xylem. And when they mix with water, they can actually become more toxic to the pests. And then finally here, products applied via soil or lower systemic bark spray can be intercepted by organic matter or off-target plants, or as we mentioned, metabolized by other microorganisms. So again, if you're doing a lower systemic bark spray, or specifically you're doing like a soil application, and it's the target tree or plant is mixed in with other plants, whether they be shrubs, trees, other things. Again, some of that active ingredient can be intercepted, and that could be off-target application. There could be some implications to that. And then, likewise, that represents active ingredient that's not getting into our target tree that might reduce our efficacy. So there are some really good reasons why we would choose tree injection as part of the tools in our toolbox. The other thing here is when we think about this kind of ecological integrity. And so when we think about trees in environmentally sensitive areas. So one of the things I always talk about, and I've talked about it already once here today, is when we're thinking about, a management plan for a tree, we want to think about the tree itself, what condition it's in, what species is it, the site, and then the pest we're trying to affect. And the site here is something that when we talk about tree injection plays in a role. So we have an example here. Our target tree here might be this hemlock, in this case here, planted though in an area that is mixed planting. We have a pond, we have all kinds of wildlife here, we have flowering plants here. In this case, we're flowering, but trust me, there's flowering plants here. So there's a lot of good reasons why we might not want to do a foliar spray for obvious reasons. There's a lot of good reasons here why we might not even want to do a systemic application like a soil application, because again, we have intermixed plants that could be intercepting the active ingredient. We have flowering plants that, of course, could take some of that active ingredient in and then translocate that into pollen or nectar, which could be harmful to some pollinators. So in a case like this, this is a great example of when I might want to do a trunk injection. This might be the best kind of tool in my toolbox for a tree in a situation like this. So again, we're reducing our off-target pests, or we're reducing the chance of damaging, off-target organisms. And there's also, of course, there's a perception of, when you're doing sprays that can be negative in some cases here. So, a situation like this is a great a great reason to use tree injection in our applications. Some other things to think about here, and this is some data that we're going to look at that describes the speed of uptake and distribution and doing a trunk application, a trunk injection or a root flare injection of a product versus a soil application of a product. And what we're looking here is we're looking at two charts. We're looking at the uptake time of imidacloprid and dinotefuran as a trunk injection. And then we were looking at the uptake time of imidacloprid and dinotefuran as a soil application. And so, looking at these charts, you might say, well, there's peaks and valleys here. What are we looking at? What I want to call your attention to here are the units. So here you can see our units go from 0, and our kind of final triangle here goes to about 200. Here, though, our units go from 0 to 25. So if we are looking at our different chemistries, whether they are imidacloprid or dinotefuran, and we're comparing, this is showing us the amount of active ingredient in the leaf tissue. So if we look at our trunk injected products here, we are getting a significantly more amount of product in our leaf tissue faster when we do a trunk injection versus if we do a soil application. So this might be one of the reasons why we want to do a trunk injection. If we have trees with active infestations, we are going to get that product into the tree so much faster to get it up into concentrations of the leaves where it's going to start doing damage to the actual pest that we're trying to do. So getting mortality of the pest. So this is a great reason why we would use tree injection. In cases like this, we have active infestations. We need to get product into that plant very, very fast. And you think of things like imidacloprid that can take anywhere from 30 to 120 days to get into the plant and be effective. Here we're looking 16 weeks after treatment, and we still have very little into the leaf tissues of the plant versus with our direct trunk injection of it. So a great opportunity here to affect pests quickly. And this is a great example looking at imidacloprid. So Zytec is our imidacloprid product. Comes in several different formulations, one being, of course, a direct trunk injection. And so you can look at the 3 different ways that you can apply Zytec in this case. You could do it as a foliar spray, where you're going to get really, really quick control, right? Because you're actually contacting the leaf where the pest is feeding. And you're going to get about 14 days of residual, about 2 weeks of residual. So low residual, but fast contact. Compare that to a soil application, where in this case, we're saying we're going to get, depending upon the species of plant, it's going to take 30 to 60 days to get into the soil, but then you get season-long control. But again, from a timing standpoint, if you're doing a soil application, we have to make sure that we are ahead of the life cycle of our target pest enough to where we are applying so that it's getting up into the tree, accumulating in the leaves, accumulating in the crown to start actually doing damage. Whereas with a tree injection, here again, we're getting efficacy within days. So we're getting product up into the plant within days and then achieving season-long control. So again, some really good reasons why we would look at trunk injection. And again, namely, these are going to be around getting the plant, in this case here, getting the product up into the plant fast to affect our pests. And then again, these things that we talk about around ecological integrity, trying to reduce the amount of pesticides out there in the environment around these plants. And then we look at some of the other reasons here why we would be using tree injection. And to kind of segue into these tree damaging invasive pests, which again, today is kind of like, how and why would we use tree injection for these pests? Well, these are just an example. This is 6 examples of invasive pests in the United States. And you can see here that, we have representation across a varying amount of, arthropods that do damage. So we have our boring insects like emerald ash borer, which was first detected in the US in 2002. Of course, we realized it was introduced long before that. We have invasive shot hole borer, which is affecting trees in California, which was first detected back in 2003, about the same time as emerald ash borer. And then we have our defoliating insects. So our boring insects that we just mentioned, now these can be tree killers. Emerald ash borer, of course, again, if you haven't watched some of the other webinars in this series, I would highly recommend you go back and review that. We're not going to really get into how emerald ash borer kills trees and the life cycle. Just know that it's an invasive pest that we are going to use trunk injection to manage. This is a tree killing pest, as we know. Invasive shot hole borer is a really interesting pest if you're not familiar with that. It has a relationship with a fungus that can actually be brought into the tree, and then that will kill the tree. So these are kind of tree killing pests these are very important insects to be managing in our landscape. And then we have, kind of going down the line here, we have things like defoliators, so our chewing insects, Gypsy Moth being one, which of course is a lepidopteran, first brought to the US in 1869. An interesting story there. It was introduced on purpose, but then it escaped, and now, of course, is a big issue. And then we have Japanese beetle, which, of course, as it said, is a type of beetle, first detected back in 1916. And so we have trunk injection methods for managing these pests, depending upon what our client's expectations are, where the tree is. And then finally here, we have our sucking insects that have been brought in and have caused a lot of damage. So one here on the East Coast that we think of a lot is Hemlock woolly Adelgid, which was first detected in 1951 in Virginia and has since spread throughout the range of hemlock here in the East for the most part. Again, this is one of these pests. This is a tree killing pest. Left untreated or unchecked, this pest can kill a tree over the course of a few years. And unfortunately, if you go out, especially into our Appalachian Mountains, we find a lot of dead hemlocks because of this pest. And then finally, one of our newer sucking insects is spotted lanternfly, which was first detected in 2014 in Pennsylvania. So this is one of these pests that it itself is probably not going to kill a tree, but it is a big issue when it comes to aesthetics. It creates a lot of honeydew, and then it can weaken a tree that will bring in other pathogens that might end up killing the tree overall. So you can see here we have, in this case here, just an example of 6 invasive pests that we can use tree injection to manage. And notice again, we have boring insects, we have defoliators, we have sucking insects, and of course we have some native pests that fall in these categories that we might also want to manage. So, looking at emerald ash borer specifically here, at this point we know that using trunk injections of emamectin benzoate are highly efficacious. And, again, if you've watched other parts of the series, you know that we can get 2 to 3 seasons of control using emamectin benzoate. The product that we provide is mectinite, 4% emamectin benzoate. And, these pictures tell a million stories here, where, here you can see our treated tree is alive and healthy, and our untreated trees are just standing dead trees. And of course, we can always look at some data here. This was provided by Dr. Deb McCullough. And you can see here our different treatment methods here, our untreated controls, and the amount of larval density per meter squared in the trunk versus our dinotefuran versus our emamectin benzoates treated at high and low, just working very, very well over a long period of time there. So pretty incredible stuff. And of course, at this point in time, we know that our emamectin benzoates work really, really well on emerald ash borer, and to the point where it is our industry standard, really. But some other things to think about, some other invasive pests where we could be using tree injection, and specifically with emamectin benzoate, and again, mectinite, our product, is gypsy moth. So again, gypsy moth is an introduced pest. Again, it might not be a primary tree killer, but it severely weakens these trees, and then other pathogens, other pests can move in and do the job. But if we look at this data here, so this is gypsy moth being fed trees that were treated with mectinite in this case. And you can see what we did is we started with 10 gypsy moth in a petri dish with leaves to feed on. And to make a long story short, that at the end of 2 days, we have 3.5 gypsy moth left alive. And at the end of 2 days in our untreated area, we only have 10 gypsy moth left alive. So, or I shouldn't say 10, we have all of our gypsy moth that we started with left alive. So this is another example of, we could do a trunk injection of mectinite. And the nice thing here, of course, is with gypsy moth, some of our other industry standards are to spray. And, depending upon where you are, you have some very large trees that are affected by this pest. So spraying becomes very, very difficult, especially if you're in a landscape situation. So having an option where you can do a direct trunk injection to reduce your population is a huge benefit for many of us. And so that's where using mectinite for gypsy moth would be a huge advantage. The other one we mentioned was Japanese beetle. And so in this case here, we are looking at mectinite versus untreated controls and defoliation. So our untreated plants, we have almost 70% defoliation. on our treated plants with a trunk injection, you can see we're only at about 10% defoliation. So another alternative, especially for your linden trees, we know now that, for our linden trees, our Tilia species trees, we can't do systemic applications of the neonicotinoids, which was the industry standard up until that restriction was there. And so we can do a trunk injection of mectinite and get really good season-long control of these pests. Now, moving away from mectinite and mectinbenzoate, now looking at trunk injections for some other invasive pests. Here we're looking at dinotefuran. Our product is Transtect infusible, so dinotefuran applied as a trunk injection. In this case here, we're looking at dinotefuran applied as a trunk injection against spotted lanternfly, which again, as if you've watched more of our series, you're familiar with spotted lanternfly. This is a huge new nuisance invasive pest here in the United States. And so what we're looking at here is we are looking at our amount of dead spotted lanternflies underneath our treated trees over the course of some time. And we have our untreated here, which is represented by this blue line. And then we have our Transtect applied as a lower bark spray, where we're seeing great efficacy. But then our Transtect infusible. The one thing I want to point out here is when we do a trunk injection of dinotefuran, going back to kind of one of those charts we looked at earlier on today, you can see that we have a huge spike, very fast control of these insects when we do this trunk injection. And again, this is anecdotal, but I was talking to somebody not long ago, and they said that, within hours, they had observed dead spotted lanternflies in trunk injected trees with Transtect. So another great opportunity to use trunk injection on an invasive pest. And then the last invasive pest we're going to be looking at here is Hemlock woolly Adelgid. And with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, you can use either Transtect infusible, which again is dinotefuran, or imidacloprid. In our case, this here is our Zytec 10%. And what we're looking at here, of course, is we're looking at the different products at different rates and comparing them to our control. And you can see we have a drastic difference in the amount of live adults when compared to control when using these trunk injected methods. So again, on hemlocks, these are often growing in sensitive areas. They're often growing down by rivers and creeks and brooks. And so this is a great option here using these trunk injected products to manage this pest in this case here. So that's just an example of some of the invasive pests outside of emerald ash borer that we could be treating for. The next thing we want to talk about, going now into chapter 2 of our best management practices. So chapter 1 is, again, why would we use trunk injection? I think we made a pretty good case for why we would use it. Now looking at different types of injection, types of tree injection, chapter 2. And so there are 2 main types of tree injection that we talk about. We talk about micro tree injection and macro tree injection. And the big difference here is the application method. This is an example of what these would look like, a macro on the left versus a micro on the right. And with macro tree injection, what we are usually doing is we are injecting large volumes of water, ounces to liters to gallons of water into a tree at highly diluted rates. And we do this so that we get increased distribution in the canopy of the tree. And we do this with fungicides, specifically fungicides that we're using for our wilt diseases. And there's a few reasons for that. One is basically fungicides don't distribute very well in the tree unless they are diluted in water. And so we find that by doing this macro injection method, we're getting much better control of our wilt diseases. Now, the context today is really talking about invasive insects. And for better or worse, I would say, for better, we can use micro injection tools for insecticides. So luckily for us, insecticides have a much lower coefficient of absorption, which means you don't need to dilute them in a high volume of water, and you can do much smaller volumes. So, we're looking at milliliters. Recall just a few moments ago when we looked at that slide with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, our rates were like 1.5 milliliters per inch, 2 milliliters per inch. So we're using very low rates of these products to get into the tree. And so because of that, we can use different types of equipment. And I have two examples here. The one, that top picture, is looking at a manual powered single port injector. And then the lower picture is looking at a multi-port injector there. So we have more options for equipment that we can use. And again, a lot easier application. So we can use micro injection for our insecticides. So continuing on with our BMP, moving from chapter 2, the types of tree injection, and knowing that with our invasive insects, we can use micro injection. Moving on to chapter 3, potential damage. And this comes up a lot, right? It seems almost counterintuitive that we are going to be drilling a hole in the tree to save it. And there's things that we want to think about there. But at the same time, and as we'll see, this can be a very viable way to manage these pests. One thing that comes up is chemical damage. And again, this is mostly where we find our fungicides that are mixed at inadequate dilutions. We can get phytotoxicity. Again, this is usually an issue with our fungicides. We don't see that kind of issue with our insecticides. Now, the other damage that we have to worry about is physical damage, because again, we are drilling into the tree to make these applications. And so this is where, when we get into the part of the conversation where we talk about how to make the actual applications, this is where we need to be really, really careful. We need to make sure we are making our applications at the correct point on the tree and that we are installing our keys correctly. This is an example of a piece of equipment that was not used correctly. And when things aren't used correctly, we have issues. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing damage caused by this piece of equipment. And all that white that you see is actually active ingredient that didn't make its way into the tree. So we have to be really, really careful that we are doing our applications correctly and that we are, understanding the right way to use our equipment. And again, with the prevalence of emerald ash borer treatments in municipalities, this has come up. And this was an article that was published a few years ago in a local newspaper where, in this case here, the application, the equipment wasn't used correctly, and they were getting some really bad damage in their trees. So something to be aware of. When we talk about doing trunk injections, ideally, we would want to repeat applications after the tree is compartmentalized those wounds. We want to reduce doing injections every year. And so with all that being said, when these are done correctly, we have almost no issues here. And that's really important. Trees are really, really tough. And a lot of this newer work shows us that, trees have adapted to deal with injury really, really well. And so there's a quote here from Dr. Cox at Syngenta Crop Protection, where he states that wounding that occurs during proper injection procedures and formulated products, that's important to know too, using the right product, for trees is of minimal concern, as healthy trees can compartmentalize and close over injection sites. And then there's some other data that was published just last year by Dr. Brazzi and his group at UMass. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at American elms that have been repeatedly injected over time. And this is really, really interesting. If you look at the presence of decay and the presence of no decay, and you look at that at injected and non-injected, you see that, even though, again, the sample size of the injected is slightly smaller, about 18 trees smaller, you'll see that, we often have, in this case, ironically enough, there is, we find more decay in our non-injected trees than over our injected trees. So what does that tell us? And we're talking about, minor pieces of decay associated with that trunk injection site. This is telling us these trees can handle being trunk injected. So trunk injection, from a tree health standpoint, if the tree is healthy in all other regards, that tree injection is a very viable way to manage these things. And especially kind of going back to thinking about these pests, these invasive pests that we were just alluding to, emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly, hemlock woolly Adelgid, that this can be a really, really good application method. And then finally, this graphic here is showing us This is an injection site from a plugless piece of equipment, our Q-Connect system, and tracing this over the course of the season. You can see by the end of the season, that injection site is completely sealed over. So again, really, really cool thing there. So now moving on to chapter 4 of our ISA BMP, application considerations. And so this is where we start talking about time of year and, when to do the actual application. So when we talk about application considerations, we want to take a few things into consideration. Bear with me. So one is we need to make sure that the plant, so when we do a trunk injection, really what we're doing by applying pressure, we're just kind of getting the process started. So we apply pressure to our system, that pushes that product into that vascular system, kind of catches up to that continuous kind of water column in the xylem. And then once it catches up to that water column in the xylem, the tree takes over. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are injecting trees when they are actively transporting water up from the roots into the crown. So, sometime after leaf out is ideal. And there's exceptions to this for sure. But ideally what we're trying to do, and especially with our insecticides, is we want to make these applications after leaf out, and we want to try to avoid treating stress trees or trees with severe dieback, because of course that's going to affect our uptake time and distribution. So that's one thing to think about. In regards to emerald ash borer and Emmectum benzoate, this has been coming up more and more. The question is, when do you treat and when's the best time to treat? This was some data that was just presented by Dr. Cliff Sadoff at one of our earlier webinars this year. And so what this is looking at Emmectum benzoate applied either in the spring of the year or in the fall of the year. And so what is demonstrated here is that this is looking at canopy thinning, and then our black dots are Emmectum benzoate as a trunk injection in the spring, and our white dots are Emmectum benzoate applied in the fall. And so what we're seeing here is it seems consistent that when we apply in the spring, we get less canopy thinning versus in the fall. And so the spring would be, from leaf out till maybe June, July timeframe, and fall is applications made after September. And so they're still effective when made in the fall, but we see that we have less canopy thinning when applied in the spring. And of course, the question is, why is that? Well, these insects, if you treat them in the spring, then you're catching the adults that are feeding on the leaves, so you're killing those adults. So you're reducing the amount of larvae that can be produced, and then likewise, whatever larvae are produced are going to be killed. Whereas if you wait till fall, that insect has time to mate and reproduce and put larvae into the tree. And so when you treat in the fall, if you wait to fall to treat, that insect has time to do damage to the leaves that entire time. So, if you have a high value tree that you're just getting to, later on in the year, we're not saying not to treat that by any means at all. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that, you're going to have to come back sooner to treat that tree. And then, again, likewise, ideally, we would schedule all of our treatments so that we're being treated in the spring and avoiding the damage that can be caused in the meantime. Moving on to chapter 5 now of our best management practice, that is administering injections. So when we talk about doing trunk injections, we say trunk injections, but really what we want to do is we want to concentrate on the root flare of the tree. And there are a few reasons why we want to do that. And so this was a graphic. This was provided by Dr. Smiley at Bartlett Tree Experts. And so number one reason why we want to concentrate on the root flare of the tree is that, simply stated, we have more sapwood down there. So we have a wider area of sapwood on the root flare. The vessels within that sapwood that are carrying water and nutrients up from the roots, up into the tree, are wider. So we simply stated we have more space to put products in. And so that helps with our uptake time. It also helps with our distribution, not only up into the tree, but also radially around the tree. So we find that when we inject into the root flare, we're getting better uptake and distribution both up and radially around the tree. So From a speed standpoint, we're going to find that our injections are going to go faster when we're down on the root flare. From a distribution of the product standpoint, we're going to get better distribution when we're lower down the root flare. And then finally, data has shown that that root flare will actually seal over 1.5 times faster than up on the trunk. So going back to those photographs of the injection wounds sealing over, that area of the tree will seal over faster. So again, we don't have that wound. And again, that's more for our clients. So they have to come back and see that wound. And with all that being said, I'm going to turn it over now to Matt Karst, and he's going to go through a demonstration of our Q-Connect system and how you would apply that into the base of a tree.
So first off, we're going to take the diameter of the tree at chest height. The abbreviation you'll see used is DBH, which stands for diameter at breast height, which is about 4.5 feet from the ground. So then we will take the diameter, and we see that this tree is about 21 inches in diameter. Now, when determining dosing for a tree, you're going to want to look at a couple different factors. How large is the tree that you're treating? What type of insect you're treating for, and how bad is the infestation in the immediate area that you're treating. For this tree, it's looking pretty good because this is the second round of treatment that we've done. The area, I noticed some thinning in the canopy of some other ash. We've heard some stories of neighbors getting trees removed from the boulevard. Not sure what the reason is, but this being a 21-inch tree, and on its second dose, we'll probably lean towards the high rate. Now, when you get the diameter of the tree, that will be the indication of how many T's and injection sites you'll need to use. So since we have a 21-inch tree, we're right in between 20 and 22. So if we divide the diameter by 2, that'll give us the injection sites. So that'll leave us with 10.5. So since the kit comes with 10 T's already, I'm just going to use the 10, and that should be good enough for this tree. If you were need to add or remove any T's, you would need to buy an expansion pack from Rainbow. Now, if you were needing to, say we had like an 18-inch diameter tree, we would need 9 injection sites.
Now, you're going to want to use a cordless drill and a 15/64 high helix drill bit. So what that means is that this drill bit cuts when you're going in as well as when you're coming out. That's so you're not cauterizing the inside of the injection site and not sealing up that vascular tissue, and that's going to drastically reduce your uptake time. Now, make sure that you have the drill perpendicular to the injection site. That way you have a straight injection site and you're covering the most vascular tissue to get that injection in there. Next, you're going to want to drill 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch past the bark, and you want to go in and out. And then another way to tell if you have a sharp drill bit is if when you drill, you get these pigtails that come out. They should be long and like curly. If they're really crumbly and brown, either you've hit a decay pocket, or if they break apart a lot, then you should probably switch out your drill bit, which we recommend every 5 to 10 trees. Now, once you get the injection site drilled, you're going to want to put your T's in right away so you don't lose the injection site. I like to work my way around the tree as I go down the harness, and I have it set up prior to that so I know where all my injection sites are going to be. When you're setting up your harness around the tree, make sure to place your T's evenly around the base of the tree and target root flares when possible. Root flares are the preferred location for injection sites because they allow for rapid uptake, have good wound closure capability, and provide uniform distribution of the product throughout the tree. So before you start pressurizing the system, what you want to make sure is that this valve to the main bottle is on. And then over here you have a pressure release valve that hits at 60 psi, which you shouldn't have to worry about because that's way higher than you'll ever be pressurizing the system. And then up here you have your standard Schrader valve attachment for any regular bike pump. And then you're going to want to go to the T on the back side of the tree and turn that on. And that'll help distribute the product through the lines while you're priming it to make sure you're getting even distribution throughout the whole tree. Now you're ready to start pressurizing the system. So you're going to want to hook up your Schrader valve. You want to pump that to about 15 to 25 psi. See the product starting to go through the lines. And now you can start opening up the rest of the lines, getting the product into the tree. Once you get all the T's opened up, you may want to repressurize the system. You can go up to 35 psi if you need to. You can see, even as I bring the pressure back up to 25 to 30 psi, the product is still moving evenly through the harness, ensuring equal distribution throughout the tree. Usually the tree takes it up pretty quick. You can see from this one that it's already pushing out air from the back here. Time for trees depends on a couple of factors: soil moisture, what the weather's been like, and how large the tree is. So as you start to see some of these T's empty out, you can close off those valves, and that'll redistribute some pressure into the other ones to ensure that you get even distribution throughout the whole tree. Now once your tree has taken up all the product and all the T's are off, before you remove them, you're going to want to release any remaining pressure that's in the bottle. Once that's good, you disconnect the quick connect and you remove the T's the same way that you put them in. Quarter turn and pull out. You can see the product staying in, no need for plugs. There may be a little bit of residual product left in the lines. The amount that this equals out to is not going to make a huge difference on your treatment.
Thanks for that information, Matt. And so you can see that setting up a trunk injection can be really, really fast and really, really effective. One question that comes up a lot is, what if you are doing multiple trees in a day? And more specifically, what if you're doing multiple trees on a site? We know a lot with emerald ash borer. If you're dealing with a large site, a municipal situation, what's the best way to be effective? So I'd like to share with you guys a real quick video that we created on leapfrogging, which is, it makes total sense, but just to show what that means and how that can be used in your operation. So hold on one second, and we'll bring that up for you.
A great way to increase your operational efficiency with ash injections is by utilizing a technique we call leapfrogging, or tree hopping. This technique is great for sites such as parks, HOAs, or properties with multiple trees. Using 2 Q-connects, you start off setting up your first tree as you would normally. Once the system is pressurized and the tree is taking up the product, you take your second system and begin setting up the second tree. After you have your second tree set up and pressurized, you then check back on your first tree. In most scenarios, the first tree will be almost, if not already done, taking up the product. You then take down the setup and either check back on your second tree or begin setting up the third tree for multiple tree sites. You would repeat this process, working your way through the site until you have all trees treated. This technique is a great way to overlap any wait time you would have in between trees and during setup. Uptake times can vary depending on the time of year, tree size, and health of the tree, so it's important to check on your trees to gauge how fast they are taking up the product. In some scenarios, the trees may be taking up faster than you can set up new trees, in which case you may want to stick to treating trees one at a time.
Great. Well, I hope you guys found that helpful. So again, administering tree injections, making sure we're concentrating on the root flares, making sure that we're using the correct equipment and correct formulations, and making sure we're doing this at the correct time of year to affect our pests are all going to be key in getting those predictable results we know we can get. So trunk injection is going to be a really fast and effective way to manage a lot of these invasive pests. So to kind of wrap up the BMPs here, we get into chapter 6, which talks about record keeping, making sure that you are making a record of your applications. And this is especially important with things like emerald ash borer using mectonite, because we want to be revisiting that tree every 2 years or so. And so we want to make sure that we have a good record of, when we were there. And this is where it comes in a little bit of, the business aspect. You want to make sure you have a record of who you need to call back in 2 years. We all have short memories. We all know, our landscape folks, our homeowners also have short memories. So we want to make sure that we are owning that, keeping a record of who we need to call and when to make sure that their trees are treated and taken care of. Kind of now going into more here, we have our appendix and of course our glossary. We're not going to talk about the glossary here in this conversation, but there's some neat appendices in the BMPs. One discussing ring porous trees versus diffuse porous trees and how that might inform how you treat them and the time it might take. An example of some of these species that are diffuse porous versus ring porous. And, again, we find that diffuse porous trees may be a little bit more difficult to inject versus our ring porous trees, which might be a little easier to inject. And then finally, in the BMP, we have an appendix that gives an example of the sample bid specifications in tree injection contract language. And so this is great for those of you that are just getting into tree injection, just getting into plant healthcare. This can really help you in developing specs and proposals for your clients so that you can help them save their trees from some of these invasive pests. So we're going to wrap up here now today, just to let you guys know that we do have a lot of upcoming webinars still. On the 13th of this month here, we will be having our very own Kent Hunnell from Rainbow Tree Care talking about the diagnostic process for managing plant healthcare issues in spring. And we have a few more coming after that, so please visit our website there. Again, thank you all so much for attending, spending time with us today. There will be a survey that will come out after we conclude today. Please take the time to fill it up. That information is very important to us, and we really appreciate that. A few more things before we get to questions. So state pesticide applicator CEUs. So if you have a pesticide applicator license in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and or Utah, get your pesticide applicator license number ready. Click on the link in the chat. Should be in there by now. In that link, you're going to log in with your email. You're going to see a unique link to take the assessment. Once you click on that link, you have 5 minutes to complete the assessment. So be ready. That's what we say. Make sure you got your license number ready. Be ready to go. Once we get that stuff back, we will submit your information to your state governing agency, and we will also provide you with a certificate of attendance. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And with that, we'll take any questions and answers that are there. Again, use your Q&A box. Look forward to seeing what we got.